Good morning, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us for Fundraising in Communities of Color. My name is Lisa Mae Simpson. I serve as the Director of Education here at Forefront, and I want to welcome all of you and thank you for joining us. We're going to get started in just a moment, but first just a couple of words. If you're not familiar with Forefront, I want to make sure that you know a little bit about us. We are the only statewide association in the United States that represents both grant makers and nonprofits, as well as their advisors. And our mission is to build a vibrant social impact sector for all the people of Illinois. We do that by providing education, advocacy, and research, and by mobilizing our members around campaigns that advance the sector. And I'll say a word at the end of this about one of the campaigns that we're engaging in right now, which is I'll Give for Giving Tuesday. Before we dive into today's content, and I'll take a minute to introduce our panelists today, just a couple of housekeeping notes. If you're hearing my voice but not seeing a slide on your computer, please take a moment now to log into the web portion of the webinar so you can see the slide decks that our panelists have prepared. And also please note that everyone's phone lines are muted to keep the background noise to a minimum. We do welcome your questions, though. We definitely want to hear those and see them. So please take a moment now to locate the chat box on your screen. Mine is on the lower left-hand corner. And we'd welcome you and encourage you to type any questions you have there, including any technical difficulties that you might be having, but especially questions for our panelists. And we will address those at the end of each of their presentations, and then we'll have more time for general questions at the end as well. One last note, too, we are recording this webinar, so if you have to step out, or if you'd like to review anything, we will send you a link after we've concluded today's presentation. So with that, we're going to get right into our presenters. Want to welcome them. We have here in this room Deidra Somerville, who is the Director of Research and Sponsored Programs at Roosevelt University. She has served as a member of the Diversity and Fellows Committee of the Association of Fundraising Professionals. She's been a member of the Breaking It Down Conference Committee since 2007 and is appointed to the Cook County Commission on Women's Issues. She is also a certified fundraising executive. JeeYeun is an independent consultant with over 20 years of experience in the nonprofit sector, specifically in the areas of education, social services, advocacy, and the arts. She is also a trained facilitator and peer counselor. She's taught college-level courses and ESL to all ages, and she is currently completing an MFA at the Cranbrook Academy of Art. And Juan Calixto currently serves as Vice President of External Relations for the Chicago Community Loan Fund. He is also a certified fundraising executive. He is the co-founder of Latinos in Development and also of the Breaking It Down Fundraising and Nonprofit Management Conference. He is also the owner and principal consultant for Ideation First. He serves as adjunct faculty at North Park University, and he is one of our instructors here at Forefront, and in fact was here just on Wednesday teaching a class on grant writing. So welcome all of you. Thank you so much for being here. I'm going to turn it over first to Deidra and let her talk to us about fundraising in African American communities.
Good morning. Good to hear and see your names. I'm going to go over some general ideas first and ground everyone in what it means historically as well as currently to engage in fundraising activities with African Americans. One thing to keep in mind is that there's been a long and storied history of giving back in African American communities, dating back definitely to the 19th century, with a lot of emphasis on institution building, and with a strong tradition of mutual aid and looking at building hospitals, building schools, building churches, and there are certain mechanisms that are consistent that have been used for that I'll talk about and try to bridge some of the historical understandings of giving in African American communities with our current reality and current opportunities. So So that's one thing I wanted to say is that consider this a part of a continuum, and your engagement is part of a very long story tradition. That begins with many places in urban areas as well, and Chicago is one of the areas that I think really showcases fundraising from that century and forward in a way that I think is really poignant and pivotal. A picture you see here is of a man who was the first one to give to the YMCA in Wabash, the Wabash YMCA. And his story is like a lot of men who came to this community from communities in the South, and actually he was enslaved in Baltimore, Maryland, and once freed, worked hard, saved his money, and made sure that he set money aside to ensure that institutions in his communities were available for those who follow, and you'll see that throughout the history of African American giving. So as I mentioned, we have a long history dating back to the 19th century. Even though our priorities have changed, we're going to go over some recurring themes, and I look forward to hearing your feedback on those and questions about those themes and ways to engage with them. And one thing that is consistent thread is volunteer associations. They are a major vehicle, have always been, and I'm sure in the current and future will be a very strong means by which you can engage African American donors. And those things that I spoke of earlier, you'll see really directly related to community-based challenges that unfortunately we know all too well that are connected with the African American community. So here's another person in history that I thought it was really great to talk about. He is the Venerable Pierre Toussaint. And the reason why he is considered the Venerable is because, for some of you may know this already, but he is actually a candidate for sainthood in the Catholic Church, and he actually was also a former slave brought to the United States in 1787, and he actually was a very prominent philanthropist in the 1800s. His home became a shelter for orphans. He supported education initiatives back then, early education initiatives in New York for all people, including folks who were formerly enslaved. He created a credit bureau and an employment agency for destitute travelers. He founded a refuge for homeless immigrants. So he was somebody who has shows and demonstrates that this idea of coming from very humble beginnings and even without having wealth in the way that we understand wealth today, still managing to make institution building a big part of his story and his legacy. And same with James Tilghman in the previous slide. You see that throughout African American history and philanthropy. So thinking about that, remember that giving is you may encounter folks from various walks of life in terms of philanthropic opportunities. Keep in mind that giving is a really big part of the community, and you might look at different economic strata in order to engage folks. So this is Jacob Lawrence and represents the Great Migration, which, here in Chicago brought as early as 1910 folks from all over the South to primarily Mississippi, as many of us know, to reestablish themselves here in Chicago, in the Chicago area. And with that reestablishment came the reestablishment of voluntary associations. And those associations were a huge part of philanthropy during the Progressive era. And I have some examples here to share with you of that time. The Gaudeamus Charity Club is one of them, and these ladies were phenomenal. I'll just say that. Social clubs in Chicago during the Progressive era, during the 1920s and 30s, were huge. They were a huge, huge deal. They were ways for women who were often wives of servicemen, wives of men who had established themselves as businessmen, educators in some cases, depending on the situation, as to organize themselves to support a lot of necessary institution building during that time in the Chicago area. The women in the Gaudeamus Charity Club raised funds for a war memorial that we now see on 35th Street and King Drive. Some of you may be familiar with it. The group of women in this picture were responsible for that. They, along with the Silverleaf Social Art and Charity Club, also organized food drives. Of course, they actually were the funding engine behind a lot of tenement settlement houses that were necessary during that time. There were quite a few black tenements that were established during that time. There were also hospitals there were 4 African American hospitals during that time in the Chicago area alone. And these women were in many ways instrumental for those hospitals existing and being built. And they, in their work, served as a buffer against a lot of the harsh realities that a lot of new migrants faced in terms of getting access to resources and even going to hospitals, because many hospitals were not serving African Americans. And so institution building in that era was actually pivotal to the actual health of African Americans and women, like we see in the Civil Rights Movement and other mediums, were a huge and pivotal and fundamental part of giving during that era. So we're going to fast forward to today and what the demographic profile of African Americans looks like today. So we're only 13% of the population, and actually the median household income is at $66,000 approximately. Despite that being a little slightly higher than the U.S. average, there's still a very high poverty rate in the African American community, and compared to other communities, not a very high number of bachelor's degrees in the community. And we have certain sectors that we're drawn to, as you can see, in management, business, science, arts, and occupations, and 25% in sales and office occupations. So those are areas where you find folks in upper management, and also rank and file, who also give through employee programs and the like. And something to keep in mind in relationship to our education attainment: the majority of business owners in the United States actually do not have bachelor's degrees. They have high school degrees. Some of you may know that. So when you think about African American business people, especially those actually who have means to give, you may not be dealing with someone with a bachelor's degree. You may be dealing with someone with a high school degree who has for many years built up a strong business, and that actually can and should be considered for solicitation. So set your expectations in a way a little differently in terms of thinking about what the wealth profile might look like. They may not be pedigreed in the way that you would consider a businessman or a businesswoman to be pedigreed. So consider that mix of profile opportunities when you look at someone who is a business person in your community, or in your church, or in some other walk of life. So continuing on with this, as I mentioned before, you have a lot of business owners in the community, but that might not square up with the number of people who actually have degrees. But look at the statistic on Cook County, which is interesting. That Cook County actually is the leading county of African American owned firms in the country. Now, Atlanta actually has as a city has a large number of businesses and business opportunities, and we've seen a lot of outmigration to Atlanta from Chicago in the last 10 years. That's one of those places, destination places, that many African Americans left to when Chicago experienced a decline in our population. But you still have a lot of vibrant businesses here, and also, of course, nationally we have a presence, and our presence is growing. I'm sure Juan and JeeYeun would also echo the fact that so-called minority businesses are growing at a faster rate than majority-owned businesses, and it's projected to be that way for a long time to come. So, looking at African American businesses as a donor cultivation pool is really worth your consideration, not only for now but also for the future. So another thing that we all also should keep in mind is how giving profiles shake out in Black community. We have a lot of interest in, I put Leave No Child Behind by Varnett Honeywood because oftentimes we see certain themes within African American giving that are worth noting, and youth figure very highly in that. Mentorship figures very highly in that. So, so when you think about what you want to do to cultivate those donors, think about voluntary associations, as I mentioned. Your lodges, your sororities and fraternities, of course, there are many across the country. Think about your various organizations that are out there that can organize folks into an auxiliary board. There are some that actually have taken that model and ran with it. Certain institutions in Chicago have very active auxiliary boards that do a lot to support giving within organizations and institutions here in Chicago. And some of those are affiliated with associations. So you may find sometimes we think about cultivating people individually or approaching people individually, but I would encourage you to also think about association that individuals have with organizations as also a means to look at African American giving opportunities or qualification opportunities. I put giving back in quotes because that's something we talk a lot about, and this qualified by a lot of different thoughts of not just giving money, but also giving time, giving talent. Consider those ideas when you're looking at cultivating and identifying and qualifying African Americans. How are you organizing your institution to create vehicles for people to feel connected to the communities that they're working with? That's a theme that you'll see a lot in corporate giving strategies where African Americans are actually at the head of those institutions. If you've noticed, they oftentimes have a pretty well-oiled machine around giving back and volunteerism. And that's growing in corporate America, and I would say it's growing also in part because of the influence that some African Americans are having in that sphere. So consider how you organize your organization to have touch points that are meaningful, that are relevant to interests that they have, and that can maintain long-term partnerships. Because these things take time. So if you're looking at someone that you've not known very well or had a long relationship with, those tools can be a good bridge to maintaining a healthy relationship over a period of time while you're in the cultivation stage. And considering different strategies, we talked about the voluntary associations. Think about the circles that you frequent when you have events. Certain events that might be happening at DuSable or happening at institutions where you might find African Americans going to an exhibit or going to other events that you may not traditionally go to, your organization may not traditionally participate in. Think about that. Think about also the Buy Black movement recently, which for many organizations may be a little bit of a stretch, but actually there have been reports of several nonprofits that have actually chosen to, as part of the Buy Black movement, to move some of their assets into black banks. And black banks, although there are only 24 in the country, are also areas of giving where you might find black wealth that you might not otherwise find, or black donors that you might not otherwise find. It may be a big leap for an organization to say, we're going to move our assets to a black bank to really show our commitment to diversity, but it might also be a way for you to look at, your organization to look at that piecemeal, or look at how to engage in that way and show some commitment in a way that's unique to your organization, that might draw some interest in identifying and qualifying donors that you might not have actually considered before. So I'm going out of order, so I talked about black banks. Sorry about that. Giving circles. Well, giving circles are I think right now there is one at the Trust. There are some in other organizations in the Chicago area, and they're growing. And they're growing in the African American Legacy Fund is one that some of you all might be familiar with. That is at the Trust. And you can find donors there who have used their donor advised funds to commit themselves to that fund. They also have been behind several recent emergency funds that have been put out by the Trust and MacArthur Foundation to address violence in the community. So there have been a lot of movement behind the scenes related to giving circles and conversations that are related to issues that are pertinent to African Americans. So considering giving circles and connecting that back to voluntary associations would be an interesting way for an organization to engage African American donors in a way that's historically relevant and also currently relevant to how many African Americans work in collectivist ways to address issues. So consider that. And also there are some nationally federated charities that are also the Black United Fund. There's one branch here in Chicago, and it's actually a national has a national reach. There's a Black Foundation in New York that's also is worth looking into. That also has individual donors as well as itself as an institution to look into. That would be important to connect with, to find out about what interest donors might have and how you can connect with them. So primary areas of giving that you should keep in mind are youth development and education, which I've mentioned, and touch points there that you can create, education institutions, primarily, majority as well as those that support students who are in minority HBCUs as well as majority institutions. Dealing with health disparities is another area, and art. You see a lot of black art that I've put here, and you'll see a lot of interest in supporting and advancing those artists, and so that they can have a voice in the community. And also, as was mentioned, supportive work by congregations that have community development corporations that tackle socioeconomic issues. We have several huge ones here in Chicago, and they are also a vehicle for African American giving that should be considered. So cultivation tips, I've kind of sprinkled some throughout, but listening is huge. Learning and listening about what it is that folks are interested in is huge. We know that as a standard practice, but definitely keep that in mind here. As I mentioned, our demographic profile is complex, so read between the lines. Don't take anything for granted. Consider what giving back means to your donor. That goes back to listening. And whatever touch points you create as your strategy are key, and make sure that those are invested throughout the organization as well as possible, so that you can continue to advocate and build bridges between yourselves and the African American community. And I recommend this book as actually a table gift, if you'd like, for a donor. It's a book that is a beautiful photo essay book on African Americans and philanthropy. That actually is a great way to demonstrate your knowledge and appreciation to a donor. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Deidra. If folks have questions, I encourage you to type them into that chat box. We will circle back to more questions at the end of all the presentations. Right now I'm going to turn it over to JeeYeun and give you something to steer with. There you go.
Okay, great. So good morning, everyone. My name again is JeeYeun Lee, and I've been in the nonprofit sector for over 20 years, working both in development as well as in programming and as a consultant. A lot of that work has been as staff and as board of Asian American organizations, primarily Korean American organizations, and of course as a donor as well. And I'm also part of the Asian Giving Circle here in Chicago, which I'll talk about a little bit later. So let's see. All right, so that's me. So I'm going to start with a little bit of history. Mostly because it is helpful to know in order to get a sense of Asian American communities. And I say that in the plural because Asian Americans in the U.S. are very diverse. People come from very different contexts in their home countries, and the specific populations of people who have come from those home countries have come to the U.S. Because of different circumstances. And so here in the U.S., we clump Asians as one quote-unquote racial group, but it is the largest continent on the globe. It's 66% of the U.S. of the world's population, and there's many different languages, histories, cultures, etc. So it's helpful to find yourself a basic primer on Asian American history, look stuff up online, and as you're meeting people and making friends, don't make assumptions, but try and learn more both about them as an individual and learn their individual stories. I do want to mention that there is still this model minority myth, which is that Asians of all the racial groups are doing the best in terms of education and economics. And there may be some communities within Asian Americans that do, but primarily it's been a way to actually divide communities of color against each other. And it actually came up during the 1960s when African Americans were pursuing both civil rights and then later Black Power movements as a way to set up Asian Americans as the "why can't you be like them" kind of group. So don't make any assumptions. That's my main point. Could you follow me? So a little bit about the demographics. Like I said, we are hugely diverse. There's at least 45 ethnicities, 100 different languages and dialects. We are 6% of the U.S. population, 19.4 million people in the last census. And in the Chicago area, the largest ethnic groups are Indian, Filipino, and Chinese. And I want to highlight that because in a lot of people's minds, the term Asian usually brings up an image of someone who looks East Asian. And in the Chicago metropolitan area, the largest ethnic groups are South Asian, people from India as a group, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka. So again, don't make any assumptions. And so the different histories have led to very different circumstances. There was a small wave of immigration in the late 1800s and early 1900s before exclusion laws were enacted. And so you'll have like fourth and fifth generation Chinese Americans and Japanese Americans who have been in the U.S. for generations and don't speak any language besides English. And then there are people who have come here as refugees. Hmong folks are people from what is in the nation of Laos who were involved in the Vietnam War and have come as refugees. It's very different circumstances. So overall, almost 2/3 of Asians in the U.S. are immigrants and were born in another country. And overall, about 1/3 are limited English proficient. So language and translation is an issue in reaching potential donors. Like I said, income levels differ. Overall, as a group, the median household income is around $72,000. But households tend to be larger, so each income is supporting a larger family and a greater number of people. And within Asian communities is very, very different. So, for example, people of Indian descent, the median household income is about $100,000, and Bangladeshis, who are also South Asian, is half. And overall, among Asian Americans, it's a 13% poverty rate. A large number have bachelor's degrees, about half of all Asians in the U.S., and that is higher than the U.S. population as a whole. But again, there are people, especially among Southeast Asians, among Cambodian, Vietnamese, Laotian folks that have lower educational backgrounds. About half work in management, business, science, and the arts. And well, according to this statistic, 90% live in households with access to the internet, which is the highest of all the racial and ethnic groups. In terms of ability to give, there are a fair number of people who have small businesses. And overall, Asian Americans own over 1.5 million businesses, employ about 3 million people. This is in the U.S. as a whole, with an annual payroll of nearly $80 billion. So, and the buying power as a group is $544 billion. And on average, Asian American households do give a larger percentage of their incomes. So that's a good segue into the philanthropic profile. Like most donors, people give to people they know. So there's a lot of giving to friends and relatives. A number of communities have traditions of pooling money in lending circles, which is not actually giving, but it is a way that people are accustomed to amassing larger amounts of money in order to support someone who needs, something to start a small business, or someone who needs a larger amount of money. So that's a model that's I'll talk about in a little bit with giving circles. And also people give a lot to religious institutions, I should say not only churches, but also temples and mosques. As well as hometown associations, given that a lot of people in the community are immigrants, people have, and especially now with the access to technology, there's a lot of connections still that people maintain with family and relatives and friends in their home countries, and also a lot of travel back and forth. There actually are a few Asian American focused community foundations, not here in Chicago, but like in New York, there's a Korean American Community Foundation. It's still, those are still fairly small. There aren't many of them, and people are still figuring out how to use that as a model for giving. But actually, giving circles are something that started about 10 years ago, and we have one here in Chicago called the Asian Giving Circle, and it's managed along with the African American Legacy Fund at the Chicago Community Trust. And all donors are also members, and there's a minimum annual contribution that you make. And people are encouraged to be actively involved in helping to set the giving priorities. And then here, the Asian Giving Circle is a bit more formal in terms of actually putting out requests for proposals and vetting proposals and doing site visits. And so in a way, it's also a vehicle for educating donors and educating folks in thinking about philanthropy. It's one of the oldest Asian American focused giving circles in the U.S., and now there's a lot more in lots of different cities. And some of them have more specific focuses, like Asian American women or Asian American LGBTQ issues, and it ties back to what I was saying before about people are used to thinking about pooling money, and so I think that's one of the reasons why it's become so popular. And like other communities, people also give their time and their expertise. There are a lot of folks who have, gotten their education here in the U.S. and maybe at a point where they are retiring and but want to stay active and involved. And like other folks, they want to give back. And a lot of times they want to be able to give of the professional skills that they've built up over their careers. Areas of giving, like I said before, not just churches, but other religious institutions, temples and mosques as well, education, social services, also issues. People, like I said, people have stayed connected. A lot of people stay connected to what's happening in their home countries, and so when when there's natural disasters or political issues that are going on, people will often band together to raise large amounts of money that they can send back home. So cultivation tips, these apply for everyone, and you all know that. But just to reiterate, it's all about relationships, being warm and welcoming. Don't get thrown off by cultural differences. I think, here in the U.S., your face has to look a certain way in order for people to feel like you want to talk to them. And, like if you're not smiling, then people look unapproachable. But I wouldn't, don't interpret that as meaning anything in particular. People have very different cultural backgrounds that they're coming from. So it just, take the time to actually get to know individuals. Translation and interpretation, I think it's helpful, and it is an investment of time, but it shows that you are trying and that you care. And so even though many people are bilingual in English, and they'll appreciate the time that you're taking to reach out. But also, if you do that, just be sure that you're doing it with a company or with a translator who knows the actual language and dialect of the communities or individuals that you're trying to reach out to. Don't assume. Build trust. Trust is a major issue. Some people are coming from countries that have recent histories of political repression or governments that can't be trusted. And also here in the U.S., during World War II, Japanese Americans were interned in camps by the U.S. government. And so official institutions, like even nonprofit organizations, are sometimes things that people aren't necessarily immediately open to building relationships with. So take the time to build trust. And that's the end of my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Again, if you have questions, please don't hesitate to type those in, and we will circle back to them at the end. And then I'm going to turn it over to Juan.
Hello, everyone. So I'm going to begin my presentation similar to what you've heard already from Deidra and JeeYeun, and you'll hear a lot of the same themes happening when you're trying to cultivate the Latino community. But first, I'm going to start with back in my early career of fundraising. I was a good fundraiser, looked at our donor records, and I saw there was this Jewish person who gave $1,000 for the last couple of years. So I went on a call, went to Skokie to his accounting office, and my goal was to try to get $1,500 from him that year. And he threw me for a curveball and said, why are you in my office asking me for money? Why don't you get money from the Latino community? You're a Latino serving youth organization. You're located in Latino community. The kids you serve are Latinos, and here you are in Skokie asking for money. So I quickly had to say, wow, when I looked at all our donors, most of them were white, a couple of Latinos and not that many. So I made it my mission to go ahead and start, okay, fine, I'm going to go ahead and get money from Latinos. And then I learned that there was a lot more to it than simply just having a goal to raise money from Latinos. So I'm going to start with the same background to understand that, because I, as a Latino, still had to understand the history and the background of giving before I can go out there and do my approach. So basically, everyone should not be surprised by the news that the Latino population in the United States is booming. It's 55 million Latinos in the United States. So I will be using the term Latinos, Hispanic interchangeably. That's very common. Different parts of the country prefer different words. So in the Midwest, Latinos is very common. Everyone say that. In Wisconsin and Indiana, Illinois. If you go to Florida, they say Hispanics. So if you go to California, they say Mexicans. Again, there's a big growing population. It's estimated to be 119 million by 2050. So that means that they're going to go from 17% of the U.S. population to almost 30%. There's estimates that go beyond 30 right now. So it's a big population. The other thing to note about the Latino community, it's very, very young. When you're thinking about the median age of 27 years old, and they're living long, past 80 years old. When you're thinking about your donors today and your donors of tomorrow, this is something to really, really consider. The most common age for Hispanics is age 9. For white Americans, it's 56. So what does that say? If your donor base is white right now and they're in their 50s, 60s, 70s, 40 years from now, you're going to have a different picture. And there are, the United States Army, the Catholic Church, all of them are looking at these demographics, and they're targeting right now the young Hispanics and saying, if we're going to maintain ourselves as an institution, we know where our members must come from. Only 20% of the Latinos are over age 50. So another thing to note is, there's all of these Latinos are coming to the United States, and they're trying to establish themselves. So this big population that's coming, are they immigrants that are coming into this country? So the question about immigration is that immigration has declined actually over the past couple of years or maintained steady. So the population growth that you will see and continue to see in the next decade and moving forward are new births, because it's such a young childbearing population. So what are these Latinos doing? They're surviving, right? They're creating businesses, and so you see 3.6 million businesses are owned by Latinos as of 2014. I'm sure that has increased now that we're in 2016. So when you think about wealthy Latinos and their businesses, it's really, really under the radar. You don't see them operating huge hedge funds, but you see them operating a trucking company that is carrying Pepsi products, and then that same trucking company is doing shipping for Walmart, and all of a sudden that trucking company is a multi-million-dollar business. Same thing. I ran into a Latino business owner, and I'm like, what do you do? Oh, that paper that McDonald's wraps their burgers in? That's what we do. We provide them that paper, and we give it to Subway. And so that's, I'm like, wow. You guys make all of these millions of dollars doing something like that. So you can see on your screen some of the industries that these businesses are in. So between 2007 and 2012, Latino-owned businesses grew by 47% compared to less than 1% for non-Latino-owned businesses. You had heard the purchasing power from the African Americans that Deidra gave, which was like 1.2, and then JeeYeun said it was about 800 million. So we're looking for Latinos. They're at 1.5 trillion in 2015. So there's a lot of spending money they have. And as I mentioned earlier, they're a very young population. So the teens are in control of billions of dollars of spending as well. So when you're thinking about this population, you really got to think about, how do I cultivate the younger generation as well. So some basic values that are instilled in the Latino community is obviously the biggest photo you see there is family. So family is very, very important, and family is not in your traditional sense, mom, pop, and child. It could be aunt, it could be grandparents, all living in the same household, and they're all part of the nucleus. The other thing that you see on the screen there is Latinos still are very, very religious. Almost 70% are still Catholic, another 20% Protestant. They're still very, very faith-based. And then they also are very, very protective of their children. When you think about the things that they would be concerned in supporting, stuff that will, advance their children is going to be very, very important to them. So when we talk about cultivating the Latino population, one thing that was mentioned before that I will continue to reiterate is trust. JeeYeun just finished talking about, some of the populations that she's dealing with may not trust government, or they'll look at institutions as not trustworthy. The Latino population also come from different countries that they've had bad experiences with in terms of government. So they came to the U.S. to start a new life. So there's a issue of trust as well. So pulling out, buying a marketing list of Latino households and sending out a direct mail appeal with no trust established, it's not going to yield very good results. So when you're talking about how do I get dollars from a donor that's of Hispanic background, you want to be able to have some kind of interaction, let them know you, have some kind of, they want to know not only what is your organization, they want to know who's your leadership, is your leadership respected by others in the community, can I, walk proudly with them in a room and say we're associated with each other. So that's really, really important. The other thing to think about is the wealth that I mentioned that the Latinos are accumulating right now. Oftentimes it's first-generation wealth. So that means, I'm not giving a trust fund that I inherited away as a contribution. This is money I created myself, and my first priority is going to be my children, right? My family. Lots of them give remittance to countries of origin. So lots of money is already going out, and then so we're another layer saying, we want some of that wealth as well. So you got to really think about that there is, if I'm going to give you, this hard-earned money and not saving it for my future generations, I really need to have some kind of trust and have some really meaningful participation in the organization and really feel comfortable giving my wealth to you. The other thing I want to mention is I always get asked all the time, Juan, we've got this diversity initiative in our organization, so can you give me a name of a Latino that can get on our board so that I can check the box off and say we've got a Latino on our board, and so that would be already something that's done. And so, my response is always, well, I can't help you with that. You really got to think about what your mission is and what somebody would be connected to, not because they have a Hispanic surname and they're making money, or they have an executive title, or they own a big company. So that's really not a genuine way to recruit someone that you want to ultimately be a long-term donor for yourself. So you really got to go to them at a meaningful way, saying, I've noticed you're into the arts, and I'm an arts organization, and I'd like to talk to you more about our mission and what we're doing. Or, an easy one would be, we help children and education and get them from high school to college, because, Latinos are very interested in the progression of their youth. The other thing I want to mention is language. 50% of the Latinos in the U.S. are dominant in Spanish speaking. So 25% are dominant in English speaking. Then the other 25% are bilingual. So when you're addressing a Latino donor, those that are dominant in Spanish speaking would naturally, be very comfortable in having a conversation about philanthropy in their first language. But, again, this is also something that I would say is geographic. So if you're in the Midwest, most are dominant in English speaking. If you go on the south border, there will be a lot more Spanish speaking, and an expectation that you can, offer literature in Spanish and make an ask in Spanish as well. So things that the Latino community are interested in giving is, no surprise, education, because that would be something that, supports their children. And another way to get them engaged is, because it takes time to build that trust, is to invite them to events, something that they can come and pay a smaller ticket dollar amount for, meet the people, start building that understanding of who you are, learn, that they can respect the leadership within your organization. And then, after that special event, don't forget, follow up with them, invite them to something else, have a one-on-one with them, and continue building that relationship. The other thing that they give, clearly, is disaster relief, basic human needs. So that's something that they're very generous in giving. Since it's still a very young population with not a very long tradition of philanthropy other than giving to the church, you want to, when you're saying, I want $100,000 as a contribution, that could be a shock, even though you did a wealth engine check and you can see they clearly have the ability to give this amount. They're not used to doing it. So they're going to, you may say, I'd like $100,000 over a 3-year period, 4-year period, and, and make it a little softer for them, because, they're thinking of, I just made this money, and I'm going to, I haven't figured out what I'm going to do with it, or how I'm going to invest it, or should I leave it for children, et cetera, et cetera. So that's a way to get larger gifts. And as part of that, being a young population as well, if you're raising for endowments, that's something that's a little tougher to get out of them, because, again, they're not thinking retirement plans. They're in their 20s, they're in their 30s, they're in their 40s, and they're thinking of, wow, let's go and start a new business, let's make some more money, let's do some new investments. And so asking for endowments would be a challenge.
Thank you, Juan, and thank you, everybody. So while you all are thinking about additional questions that you might have, we've had one for Deidra about the name of the Black-focused foundation in New York. Can you just tell us that, and then we'll type it into the chat box as well?
Sure. It's 21st Century Foundation, and it's been around since 1971. And it is, I believe, the first or the oldest African-American endowed foundation in the country.
Great, thank you. So while you all are thinking about some additional questions, I heard a lot from all of you about that this is not a quick. There are no quick fixes here. You're not going to buy a mailing list. You're not going to get that one name of that one person who's going to help you check off the diversity box on your board cultivation list. So this is something that takes time to develop the trust that you all mentioned. So there may be folks on the webinar today who are wondering, okay, so how do I make the case? I know this is important. I showed up to this webinar, right? How do I help the folks that I report to, whether that's my board, my ED, whoever it is, understand why it's important to put in the time and the energy to develop these relationships and to cultivate these donors? What would you all say to that? Anyone want to dive in and start?
I think Juan made a pretty clear and present case, actually a pretty urgent case for why the population shift is real. We are seeing population shifts in business transactionally in terms of the businesses that are growing in this country, and wealth is created through small businesses, right? And if you put that together with those businesses are largely exponentially being grown through people of color, I think that is one reason. This isn't about only the present and how fundraising is now. This is about shifting a culture of philanthropy within an organization that embraces diversity in a way that affects not only the development office, but really the whole organization. So to me, I think it's a way to open up a larger conversation about how are we positioning ourselves to really be able to capture a growing market of prospective donors that we're currently not capturing. And that conversation can't just be development officer just having a one-on-one. This is a board-level conversation. This is a program-level conversation. How are programs being engaged to support cultivation strategies with donors that can help them feel a touch point with what you're doing and connected to what you're doing? I've had a donor, a very high-level donor, want to come with me to a prison because the organization I was working with prisons, and he wanted to go to the prisons to see the program that we were trying to build there because he wanted to meet the men there and shake their hand. And you don't see that with a lot of donors, but for this donor, that was really important. And so you have a real case to be made that this is a larger issue than just a current donor pool for this year and next year. This is about setting up opportunities for the future of your organization to be successful in a growing population of people.
Thank you, Deidra. So one last question before we wrap up, and a lovely segue. Thank you, Vanessa, for your question. Vanessa, you asked, how does social media and online giving fit into efforts to develop donor bases among minorities? And there's a slide up here about our I'll Give campaign, so that's a great segue. Any thoughts that any of the panelists would like to share about your experience with that?
Just for the Latino population in general, as you've seen from the demographics, it's such a young population. They're all into social media. They have their phone glued to themselves. So everything in terms of communications and attracting the 20, 25-year-olds and building a long-term relationship because they'll be your 40-year-old donor. Definitely social media is a way to reach them, to invite them to events, and to get messages out about your mission.
Anything else that anyone would add? JeeYeun or Deidra?
I think this goes back to listening and learning about what your donors, who they are and what they're interested in, And the conversation can vary depending on the type. If you're dealing with an African-American businessman who, again, has a high school education and runs like a successful trucking business or hotel business even. We have the South Loop Hotel is black-owned. Many of you may or may not know that. Which isn't far from where we're sitting right here in Forefront. So, if you're having a conversation with one of the owners there or investors there, and he's not into the social media in the way that maybe a millennial might be, you learn that through conversation. You learn that through listening. So I think it's a matter of listening and learning what your donors are interested in.
Yeah. And I would add to try and as you meet people, to try and figure out what online networks people are involved with, and what social media circles. And I think that's also highly language dependent. Even though there's a lot of internet use, I think it differs greatly by community. How people engage online, and so I think it really takes knowing how are people getting any kind of information and communication online or through social media in order to figure out how to reach people.
Terrific. Thank you all so much. Thanks for those good questions. I want to thank each of our panelists again for joining us today, and thank you all for dialing in. Again, you'll get a link to this recording afterwards, and I hope you will join us again for a future learning opportunity. Thanks, everyone. Enjoy your day.